Good evening and welcome to all our webinar participants. My name's Abigail Brundee. I am the recently arrived director of the British School at Rome. Really pleased to be here this evening, albeit only virtually, in the company of Dr. Edward Sutcliffe, who's a lecturer in medieval Christianity at the University of Bristol. I first met Ed in a kind of even more virtual way when I had the opportunity to come over to the BSR in July to do a sort of handover process with my predecessor as director, and Ed was enclosed in his room in quarantine as a sort of ghostly presence in the building. And on the first evening I was here, there was a celebratory glass of Prosecco for some reason or another, and one glass was carried carefully upstairs and placed outside his door so that he could emerge when there was nobody else around and retrieve it. And this seems sort of somehow an apt memory, given the topic of tonight's talk. I did then have the great good fortune to actually see Ed out of his room when I came back to the BSR at the end of August, and he was released back into the daylight, and we overlapped for the very final part of a slightly disrupted Rome fellowship that he spent with us here at the British School. And it's excellent that tonight's talk is based on the research that you did while you were in Rome over that initial longer period, and then a COVID-related disruption, and then a final closing period where I was able to make your acquaintance. So I'm really pleased that we had the chance to meet in person. So as I say, Ed's talk tonight comes out of that Rome-based research, and also just to flag that he has a forthcoming book, but he also has more immediately an article forthcoming in the Journal of Medieval History related to the work he's going to be presenting this evening. And the title of his talk is Leprosy and its Similitudes in 13th Century Italian Preaching. Over to you, Ed.
Great, thank you very much, Abigail. I will just get my slides up. As I do so, I'll mention that, as you may be able to hear, I do seem to be coming down with a bout of freshers flu. So I apologize if my voice is difficult to follow at times, or indeed if I need to take a brief pause to sip some water or rest my vocal cords. So my apologies in advance for that. Thank you, Abigail, for that kind introduction. I'm very sorry not to be able to be presenting in Rome in person, though obviously, given the cold I seem to be coming down with, it's probably for the best that you're all safely on the other side of a screen from me. My topic today, as Abigail said, is leprosy and its similitudes in 13th century Italian preaching. And since I submitted that title, I think the ground I will cover has shifted slightly from what I was expecting to talk about, but I think that nevertheless the title still holds. And the work I will be talking about forms part of the wider project that I started at the BSR back in 2019 in pre-pandemic times, with a project addressing the presentation of leprosy in Italian sermons from the 13th century. And particularly trying to trace the advent of sophisticated medical learning within such sermons. And I will talk a bit about that today. What I want to do today is to talk about the way in which leprosy was used by preachers to construct metaphors in their sermons. So I want to focus on just a small part, if you like, of that project. And I think to explain what I want to do, I will pose a hypothetical question that I will then attempt to answer in the rest of my lecture. And the question is, if I were to assume that I were, say, a Dominican friar in Florence in 1270, and I wanted to preach a sermon in which I intended to use the story of Christ healing the disease of leprosy as a way of convincing my audience that they were a bunch of sinners and reprobates who needed to come and see me and do their confession and turn to a life of penance. if I wanted to do that, to preach that sermon, how exactly would I go about it? How could I talk about and describe the leprosy that is mentioned in biblical narratives of healing in such a way that I can convince my audience to connect this imagery, this idea of leprosy, to their own spiritual condition? So to answer this question, I need to further ask what I know about leprosy, what my sources of information are when I think about the disease of leprosy. How, as a 13th century preacher, am I going to set about defining leprosy? How do I describe it? Are there ways in which I can subclassify it or discuss it systematically? And how can I use all of this information to build up a series of metaphors, or a metaphor that will allow me to use the concept of leprosy as a way of effecting a religious, a spiritual response in my audience? So to do so would be to engage in what I am calling similitudes in the title of this paper, which is really just a fancy Latin term for similes. So I will try to, as a preacher in the 13th century, describe leprosy and then build some similes, some figurative language, some metaphors that will allow me to connect that disease to the spiritual condition and state of the people I am talking to. And what I want to suggest in this paper is that essentially there are three strategies that would be open to me as a preacher that would allow me to build these figurative connections between the physical disease of leprosy and the spiritual state of my audience, or the people listening to me. And I will come on a bit later on to survey those three strategies and talk a little bit about their significance. But before doing so, I want to deal with a few preliminaries, talk a little bit about methodology, and set some parameters for what I will be discussing here. And the first thing that I want to do is to talk in a little bit more detail about the historiography of leprosy, which I'm sure is everyone's favorite subject. To do so, I'm going to take a slightly closer look at the image that is on screen here, which is from a 13th century Swiss, I think, manuscript, currently held by the Getty Museum. And this depicts a woman providing some food and implicitly some relief to an individual who very clearly has leprosy and is lying in their bed. And I think that for many people, the words medieval leprosy, the idea of medieval leprosy, conjures up a series of quite lurid and overwhelmingly negative ideas and associations characterized by exclusion, isolation, fear, hatred, death, contagion, and so on. And while this image of medieval leprosy does have some basis in fact, the way that we think about leprosy in the Middle Ages was conditioned and largely created in the 19th century. And there's been some very good work looking at how colonialists in the 19th century used the spectre of medieval leprosy to justify their own public health policies. For much of the 20th century, this overwhelmingly negative association of medieval leprosy with exclusion and fear and isolation and death also dominated scholarly understandings of leprosy in the Middle Ages, leading to books with revealing titles such as Leprosy, Disease of the Soul, published in 1974. In more recent decades, from the 90s onwards, a series of studies have sought to revise and refine and rebalance this portrayal of medieval leprosy. The work of F.O. Tuati and Carol Rawcliffe has been particularly influential in altering the kind of perceptions that we have of what life was like for people with leprosy in the Middle Ages. For an Italian context, a collected volume of essays came out in 2012, Malsani, Lebbra e Leprosi nel Medioevo. which provides a series of useful essays and case studies of leprosy in a medieval Italian context. And taken together, this revisionist work constitutes a rebalancing, if you like, of our perceptions of medieval leprosy. These scholars have shown that while earlier ideas may not be completely false, though some traditions about medieval leprosy have been shown to be complete fabrications, the way that leprosy is often thought about and talked about represents a very narrow and imbalanced selection of medieval evidence, so narrow, so imbalanced as to distort the record entirely. And reflecting on some of these changes in an article a few years ago, Elmer Brenner of the Wellcome Trust summarized this situation, writing that the picture of medieval leprosy is clearly much more complex than the simple model of exclusion. So this work has pointed to various findings and observations that have helped to alter the way that scholars think and write about medieval leprosy. For instance, it's been shown that it was very rare for people with leprosy to be confined to leprosaria, to literally be locked up. It's also been shown that hospital communities where lepers lived often enjoyed substantial legal and economic benefits and advantages. The idea of lepers being excluded from society has been slightly revised, and scholars might now talk about a reconfiguration or a change of social ties rather than a complete severing of social relationships. From a theological perspective, perhaps more important is that people with leprosy remain very much a part of the Christian community, and they retain access to the sacraments and remain members of the Roman Catholic Church. So this is all important in adding a little bit more texture and a little bit more balance to the background idea of leprosy in the Middle Ages. In particular, there are three trends, if you like, that that scholars have pointed to that are visible in the 12th century, but that coalesce particularly in the 13th century, and that illustrate this more complex idea of how medieval people thought about the disease of leprosy. And they're all, one way or another, vaguely reflected in this, this image that I sent in for promotional material for this talk. And the first thing I want to talk about, the first of these three trends, is the idea of charity, and particularly in an Italian context in the 12th and 13th century, if you like, the emerging middle classes of the Italian communes were increasingly seeking strategies through which they could engage in charitable work, charitable endeavor, to offset the anxiety they might feel about their increasing levels of wealth. And the idea of charity is obviously reflected in providing good, merciful Christian care to the sick, as shown here. The writing on this text, sorry, the text on this image, rather, the writing on this image reads quod uni ex his minimis meis fecistis, which is from Matthew 25, and is usually translated something like, what you do for the least of these my brothers, you do for me. So this is an image that captures the very Christian, very medieval interest in performing acts of charity, and doing so with the consciousness that the people receiving that charity might in some way be aligned with Christ. And there's a lot of medieval material associating Christ with having the appearance of leprosy, though I would be sidetracked if I dwelled on that for any longer. The second thing I want to use this image to highlight is the increasing provision of institutional care for people with leprosy in the form of leprosaria, which become increasingly common over the course of the second half of the 12th century and then explode in popularity in the 13th century, providing a context in which this impetus to charity and charitable provision can be met. And many of these institutions adopted para-monastic ways of life with vows and habits. So the woman depicted providing care here may well be intended to signify somebody who is a lay attendant at one of these hospitals. The third trend, the third change that is occurring in the 13th century that I want to point to, and which is quite tenuously reflected in this image, is the increasing availability of medical theory and medical knowledge as a way of thinking about the disease of leprosy. Medical learning in Latin Europe was rejuvenated by a series of translations, beginning first in the 12th century with Constantine the African, and then continuing at the school of Salerno, the famous school of medicine in southern Italy, and then in the late 12th and early 13th century, also taking place in Toledo with the School of Toledo and their translations of Arabic medical, anatomical, and philosophical works. One of the more practical effects of this medical knowledge was an increased awareness of the types of diet that might be recommended for lepers. And fish, which is shown being given here to the individual with leprosy, is something that was usually recommended in these medical texts. So in all, in the 13th century, there is a changing landscape in which a growing interest in performing works of mercy, a growing network of institutional centers of care for people with leprosy, and a growing awareness of medical theories about leprosy have the potential to alter and change the way in which the disease was understood. Despite those more positive trends I've highlighted, and despite the work of revisionist historians seeking to rebalance representations of medieval leprosy, it does remain the case that in the vast majority of medieval literature, particularly medieval religious literature, there is a very close association between leprosy and sin, and that's very much reflected in the type of sermons that I am working with here. And in most of these texts, in fact, in all of them, almost universally, leprosy is understood to be a figurative representation of sin. However, I think we can be a bit more cautious and precise than just saying that there is an equation between leprosy and sin. And to demonstrate this point, to talk about it a little bit more, I want to quickly work through a couple of further images of leprosy. This time images from Rome and from the 13th century. So these are from the Oratorio di San Silvestro at Santi Quattro Colonnati, where there are a series of images depicting the life of Sylvester, Pope Sylvester II, who, according to later medieval traditions, had been responsible for converting the Emperor Constantine. And the narrative contained in Lives of Sylvester and represented in these images is perhaps best known for featuring as part of the donation of Constantine, the later medieval forgery that purported to show the Emperor Constantine granting power and authority to the Roman papacy. But the story, the encounter between Constantine and Sylvester unfolds as follows. Constantine, prior to his conversion, is described as a persecutor of Christians, someone who was very much on the wrong side of history. And he was struck with a foul leprosy. And you can see in the image here, the spots on his arms and his face denoting this condition. Eventually, Saints Peter and Paul appeared to him in a dream, as we see here, and told him to seek out Sylvester and to ask Sylvester for help. So Constantine does so. Sylvester arrives and is able to show a depiction of Saints Peter and Paul, the men who have appeared to Constantine in this dream. They talk, Sylvester converts Constantine, and Constantine makes a confession of faith and is then baptized, at which point the foul leprosy leaves his body and he is healed of this physical disease at the same time as being healed of his sinful state. So this kind of story very neatly and very clearly demonstrates the connection that exists between leprosy and sin. But there are two caveats that I want to highlight before I move on to the sermons I'll be talking about today. The first is that insofar as leprosy is useful as a metaphor for sin, as a similitude for sin, it's useful in contexts where that leprosy is transient and where it disappears. So the leprosy of Constantine is removed. In the biblical narratives I'll be talking about later, leprosy is miraculously healed by Christ and it disappears. So the utility of leprosy as a metaphor for sin depends on the fact that it can be miraculously cured, even though all medieval authors were in agreement that leprosy as a physical disease was virtually incurable, except through miraculous intervention. So I think it's important to keep this in mind, that leprosy stands for sin, but it usually stands for sin that can be cleansed and removed and done away with. The second point that I want to make is that the association that's drawn between leprosy and sin is often quite nuanced and quite subtle, and it takes a very specific form. And the preachers I'll be talking about use the idea of physical leprosy, language relating to leprosy as a corporal disease, in order to structure and populate a moral discourse. So in order to build a figurative discussion of the state of the spirit. It does not follow, in my view, that that moral and spiritual discourse can then be projected back onto individuals with leprosy. So in other words, the target of these metaphorical connections between leprosy and sin is not individuals who are suffering from the corporal disease, but rather is all humans who are all sinners and who all need to attend to the state of their souls and seek healing. So the intention of the preachers I'm looking at here is not really to talk about, for the most part, the causation or the moral causation of physical disease. Of course, that doesn't mean that the consistent use of metaphors connecting a disease with a particular sin or with a sinful condition had no effect. And Joseph Ziegler, who's written on medical knowledge in later medieval sermons, suggests that inevitably the routine use of medical metaphor would lead to the signifier and the signified becoming fused together in the minds of those consuming the metaphors. And this may or may not be the case, but it remains that the intention of preachers when they talk about leprosy as a source of imagery for their metaphors generally are not intending to say anything whatsoever about individuals with the physical disease. And Constantine is the subject of a very neat, useful example of a preacher attempting to address and control this relationship between corporal reality and spiritual metaphor. And prior to his vision in which Peter and Paul appear to Constantine, he has been given advice by his physicians that in order to cure his leprosy, he should slaughter children and bathe in their innocent blood. Which is what we are looking at in this image here, or rather, I think we're looking at Constantine on the verge of relenting and saying, no, I'm not actually going to do this. This story appears in a sermon by Luca da Betonto, who was a preacher active in southern Italy in the 1230s, and who used this example to talk about how metaphors of leprosy operate in his mind. He wrote that Constantine, made leprous, was deceived by idolatrous priests, saying that if he immersed himself in the blood of innocent children, he would be cleansed of leprosy. But they too were deceived, since they had discovered it written that leprosy could be cleansed by the blood of innocents, and they had understood this with respect to corporal leprosy, when in fact it ought to be understood with respect to spiritual leprosy, from which only the blood of Christ can cleanse. So in other words, the preacher here, Luca, is suggesting that it would be a mistake to confuse metaphors of sacramental healing with the actual physical disease of leprosy. In other words, some of the things written about leprosy are not true in a literal, physical, and corporal sense. And I think it's worth keeping this distinction in mind when working through the very rich and often rather lurid material that appears in 13th century leprosy sermons. The moral message that the imagery of leprosy is used to convey cannot necessarily simply be projected backwards upon to the physical disease and to the people who actually have it. I'm going to pause for a moment and just take a sip of water. Great. Okay. Before I get to my 3 strategies for building these figurative metaphors, I just want to talk very briefly about the kind of source material that, that I've looked at for this project and in my wider work at the BSR. The project looks at sermons, which I think are a very useful tool for studying medieval religious culture, because they are tools of mass communication, insofar as such things existed in the 13th century. They are a medium that intersect a lot of different social and intellectual contexts. In particular, they provide a bridge between elite intellectual contexts and the day-to-day life of the laity. And they're also useful and important because they are a very rich and a largely untapped resource. For the most part, what I have been looking at in this project are large collections of model sermons, which might look something like this. And model sermons are texts that are at least one step removed from the actual process of preaching a sermon. These are texts that would either have been written down in advance to provide a script for preachers to read out verbatim or adapt, or these are sermons that would have been written up after the actual delivery of a sermon to provide a polished record of the event. And hundreds of thousands of medieval Latin sermons survive, most of them in large collections where you might have several hundred folios containing several hundred sermons. Usually these collections, well, they can be quite varied. So this is one example that I looked at. Here is another. These are chosen more or less at random based on what I had pictures of to hand. You can see that this is a lot less appealing as a manuscript. And then I've also used some online texts, such as this digitized microform sermon. So the format of these sermons can vary, but there are several points of consistency that I want to quickly highlight. The first is that all of these texts, even this one, which is the most visually appealing, are working manuscripts. They aren't presentation copies, and they are not decorated very much at all. They might just have an initial to mark the beginning of a given sermon. The sermons are all arranged according to a liturgical scheme or cycle, and they tend to be rubricated. So there is a rubric on each of these sermons detailing the occasion for which it was written. And I don't know if my mouse is visible, but never mind. In this instance, down towards the bottom left-hand corner, we can see the fourth Sunday after the birth of the Lord. In this example, the rubric is in fact behind my Zoom video screen, but in the margin, there is a note there saying that this is a sermon for the third Sunday after Epiphany. And in this instance, on the left-hand side, the slightly lighter text is indicating that this is a sermon for the 14th Sunday after Pentecost. And together, model sermon collections often provide a text for the entire liturgical year. But if you know which kind of text is likely to come up on which day, which kind of extract from Scripture will provide the readings for a given liturgical day, then you can usually anticipate the places within a sermon collection where leprosy is likely to appear. So in particular, there are two dates within the liturgical year where lectionaries will prescribe passages from the Gospels which mention leprosy and which talk about leprosy. And they are the two dates that I've just mentioned, the 14th or sometimes the 13th Sunday after Pentecost and the third Sunday after Epiphany. So most of the sermons I have looked at for this project have been preached for those particular days. And this, I think, is important to stress because it means that the preachers in question have not plucked the idea or the imagery of leprosy out of thin air. They have not spontaneously decided that this will be what they'll talk about on a given day. Rather, they are responding to a text that is fixed, that is prescribed for them, that is the gospel associated with that Sunday within the liturgy of the tradition they are within. So in a sense, the preachers I'm looking at are responding to an invitation provided by this scriptural text to focus on the idea of leprosy. The actual biblical texts on which they are preaching the extracts from the Gospels are fairly formulaic in terms of being healing miracles in which one or more people with leprosy approach Jesus and either call out for healing or perhaps fall on their knees and adore him or recognize his divinity in some other way. And they are then either healed and sent off to the priests of the old law to be ritually cleansed, or they are sent to the priests and they are healed as they go. But in essence, these stories are quite straightforward. Sick people approach Christ, ask for healing, and receive it. And these are the narratives that my preachers are using in order to try to convince everyone who's listening to them to do the same, but with reference to their soul. So to approach Christ, to seek sacramental healing, not for leprosy, but for the spiritual sins which are staining, corrupting, and disfiguring their souls. So as I've said, in order to make this case, to work outwards from that biblical narrative and to describe leprosy in a way that will be effective in triggering a response from those people listening, preachers in 13th century Italy used three overlapping strategies, which I will now briefly survey and run through in my remaining time. The first of these strategies is what I am calling the scriptural strategy, which is to say that in order to break down the idea of leprosy and turn it into a system of metaphors that can be used to diagnose spiritual diseases of sin, you can simply turn to the Bible and you can use material from the Bible to make sense of leprosy, to describe it and define it and categorize it. And one good example of this comes from a preacher called John of Castello, writing probably around about 1270, though like many of the preachers I'll be talking about, today, getting a precise idea of when and where they were active is often rather difficult. I'm sorry, I don't have a translation up here for John of Castello, but he begins by quoting from the scriptural passage he's preaching on, which describes 10 men who were 10 leprous men running up to Christ. And then he says that there are three things to talk about with reference to this gospel passage. So he then breaks that gospel passage up into three sections, three different parts of that story. And then he writes that morally, with reference to that first part of the gospel passage, these 10 lepers can be understood as the 10 sins which stain the church of Christ. So in other words, this narrative of 10 people being healed by Christ can represent 10 sins that exist within the contemporary church. And to explain what they are, John offers a catalogue of, I think, all of the occasions where leprosy is mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. So he systematically runs through these 10 sins that are embodied by these 10 people with leprosy from the gospel narrative. And he does so by linking them with individuals who are described as having leprosy in, elsewhere in scripture, mostly from the Old Testament. So, for example, he says that the sin of pride, superbia, is represented by Naaman, a Syrian general who gets leprosy and is cured by being baptized by Elisha in the river Jordan. He then goes on to identify simony as another sin that is staining the church of the Lord. And simony is embodied by Giesi, who is a servant of Elisha and who falsely claims a reward from Naaman in exchange for his healing. So simony refers to the buying or selling of spiritual goods or benefices. The sin of ambition is embodied by Uzziah, king of Judah, who attempted to usurp the priestly function, who attempted to take control of the religious life of Israel as well as its political life, and who was punished accordingly by being struck down with leprosy. Envy is embodied by Miriam, the sister of Moses, who is briefly struck with leprosy after murmuring and speaking out of turn about the marriage that Moses had intended to contract. Hypocrisy, according to John, is demonstrated by the hand of Moses in Exodus, as Moses is preparing to lead the people out of Israel. His hand is briefly turned white with leprosy as a demonstration of the power of God, which John reads as a symbol of hypocrisy. The sin of inobedience is linked to Simon, and I'm not entirely sure who John of Castello is thinking of here. There is a Simon the leper who is mentioned in the Gospels, though what he has to do with disobedience is not all that clear to me. And then finally, the remaining four places in this tenfold scheme are taken up by 4 people with leprosy who are sitting outside the gate of Samaria during a siege. And when God scares off the besieging army overnight, they rush to the camp of the enemy and indulge themselves and then argue with one another. And as a result, these 4 represent greed, lust or excessive indulgence in luxury, detractors or slanderers, and flatterers really is the 10th one here. So by cataloguing biblical examples of leprosy, John of Castello is able to turn this story of 10 lepers being healed by Christ into a nice catalogue of sins that can be used to diagnose the moral and spiritual failings of his contemporaries. And this is one way of constructing a scriptural understanding of leprosy. Another way of doing so, and a much more common one, in many ways, the classic interpretation of leprosy in medieval preaching, is to turn to the text of Leviticus. Leviticus 13 and 14 contains the ceremonial purity laws These laws describe leprosy in quite a lot of detail. And the description that they contain is obviously extremely useful for preachers who want to talk about leprosy and to use leprosy as a source of metaphor for sin. The practice of using the Levitical categories to understand leprosy goes right back to at least Augustine, who read the different types of leprosy described in Leviticus as embodiments of different types of heresy. In the example I've given here, which I don't think I'll read out in full, Anthony of Padua is using these categories of leprosy found in Leviticus to set out a scheme of characteristics of the disease. So he's talking about different types of leprosy, and he's talking about places where leprosy can arise. And having set out these lists, he then goes back through to explain how each of these Levitical varieties of leprosy embodies a particular sin that he wants to criticize and that he wants his audience to be aware of. So Anthony of Padua here is representative of a very common tradition of turning to these Levitical categories of leprosy in order to make sense of the disease. And there are obviously advantages to doing this, to using the Bible as a source of material to talk about leprosy. The Bible is an authoritative text, it's reasonably accessible, and you can access these kinds of metaphors and this kind of material very easily if you're a preacher by looking at commentaries on scripture, by looking at the ordinary gloss, or by looking at other resources. So in many ways, this is a straightforward way of understanding leprosy that is authorized by scripture and is therefore very appealing and very successful. However, there are some potential problems with using scriptural models of leprosy, and particularly with using the Levitical classification of leprosy as Anthony does here. In particular, I want to suggest that in a 13th century context of renewed medical knowledge and widespread institutional care of people with leprosy, it may have been increasingly clear that the description of the disease given in Leviticus does not match up all that well with the disease that people were experiencing, or with the disease that was being described in contemporary medical textbooks. And I think it's now reasonably well known that the condition we call leprosy, which is clinically Hansen's disease and which was present in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, is not the same as the leprosy of scripture, which appears to be a different condition or a different category of conditions. And it's often suggested that pre-scientific scholars and commentators in the Dark Ages were, of course, completely unaware of this discrepancy. In fact, there are several examples of 13th century preachers and commentators who notice that the disease with which they are familiar does not match up all that well with the disease that is described in scripture. William of Auvergne, who was Bishop of Paris and Chancellor of the University of Paris in and around the 1230s, I can't remember his precise dates, suggested that the text of Leviticus greatly misuses the term leprosy because it describes a vague condition that appears in the beard, in clothes, and in the walls of houses, amongst other things. So there may have been some consciousness that scriptural accounts of the disease did not match up all that well with lived experience. And it's perhaps as a result of this that although these scriptural ways of understanding leprosy continue to be used right through the Middle Ages and beyond, in the 13th century, we also see alternative ways of constructing this idea of leprosy. And the second strategy I want to briefly survey is what I'm calling the social or the general model. And really, this is a category that is defined negatively. So I ascribe to this category sermons which neither used a biblical system of classifying or understanding leprosy, but also do not use sophisticated medical theory in order to make sense of leprosy. The social or general model is, well, the way I am understanding and defining it is a way of portraying leprosy that reflects and resonates with the lived realities of leprosy, so with the experiences that people might have had of the disease. It is, if you like, a way of approaching the disease that represents what the man on the street or on the Clapham omnibus might have understood about the condition. Typically, it's characterized by describing leprosy in terms of it being an incurable disease that infects the whole body, that might be contagious, that might render people abominable or make them stink, and that leads to separation from the healthy, and that might disfigure the face or cause marks on skin. So it's a strategy of defining leprosy that is quite broad and quite flexible. And I am conscious of time, so I'll run through these examples very quickly. But Jacopo De Beradjin, a very influential and famous preacher from the end of the 13th century, I think talks about leprosy in a way that fits very neatly with this idea. So in this sermon, he is talking about the way in which the sick person who is healed, so the person with leprosy who is healed, is designated as a sinner, and sin is signified through leprosy, he says, for three reasons, which he then runs through. The first of them is because leprosy is contagious and sin also is contagious. So in the same way that a leper might cause somebody else to get leprosy, so too a sinner might cause someone else to get, well, to enter into a condition of sin. And he talks about this by reflecting on the way in which when you have lepers gathering with other lepers, that is mutually bad. When you have healthy people gathering with healthy people, that is mutually good. But when you have a mixed encounter, the results are more ambiguous, because lepers might be helped through contact with the healthy. So contact with healthy people might be beneficial to lepers. So while it's not dangerous for people with leprosy to stand with the healthy, it is dangerous for the healthy to stand with lepers. So in other words, Jacopo here is trying to construct an understanding of the effects of sin and association with sinners by reflecting on the implications of spending time with people who have leprosy and the threat that might lead to infection. So in doing so, I suggest he is playing upon contemporary understandings of the disease and the dangers that it might pose. But he's not drawing on any detailed medical material, and he's not talking about scripture here. He goes on to point out that leprosy represents sin because it's a very dangerous disease capable of infecting all of the body rather than just part of it, and it therefore should be feared and avoided, much like sin. And again, I think he is playing on contemporary perceptions here. And then thirdly, his third example is that sin is signified through leprosy because it makes people fetid and abominable, and so lepers are separated from others. So again, Jacopo here, I think, is exploiting contemporary ideas about what leprosy does to the body and how people react to those with leprosy, and is also reflecting upon the fact that lepers are separated from the healthy within his own society. And he goes on to write that God created 4 different places: heaven, earthly paradise, so the Garden of Eden, the world in which we all live, and hell. And he explains with examples that people with leprosy cannot be allowed to stay in any of the first 3 of those conditions, and in this, any of those 3 locations. And in the same way, people who are sinners, people who are unrepentant sinners, cannot remain in any of these places. And the only place where they can end up is in hell, which is their leprosarium, he writes. So he is using the contemporary social experience of people with leprosy, moving out of towns and cities and dwelling in specialist hospitals, as a way of reflecting upon the isolation and the exclusion of sinners who will be consigned to hell. So these are some examples amongst many of what I have called the social model of understanding leprosy. And I think that this would have some considerable advantages in that it seeks to portray the disease in a way that would be recognizable, that would be very immediate, that would be emotive, and that would be very intuitive as well. The potential disadvantages, if you're a preacher, of using this method is that it's a bit vague, it's not very systematic. And particularly in a context where medical knowledge and medical theories of leprosy are increasingly available, I think it's perhaps inevitable that the third strategy I want to turn to is what I am calling the medical model, or the medical strategy, in which contemporary medical theory is leveraged in order to build metaphors around leprosy. And medical texts in the 13th century were increasingly widely available, both in terms of translations from Greek and Arabic medicine and in terms of newly composed texts. This is also a period when medicine was becoming increasingly established in centers of learning and in the major European universities. And some work has been done on the use of medical metaphors of leprosy in religious literature, but all of the examples that have been studied previously pertain to a slightly later period of the 14th century. So the material I'll very briefly run through here is from significantly earlier. And I apologize, my throat is on the verge of giving up, I think. So very quickly, an example of medical knowledge in a sermon on leprosy is provided by Servasanto of Faenza, writing probably in the 1260s. And he gives a detailed account of the medical nature of leprosy and of medical theories of its causation. He writes that leprosy arises from the four humors when they become putrefied and corrupted and transformed into black choler. Constantine the African says that leprosy is a cold and dry disease born from strong and putrefied I've completely lost my mind. Strong and putrefied black choler and appearing on the surface of the skin, on account of which Gregorius says that leprosy is a defect of the skin in which putrefied humors are mixed with black bile. And Servasanto goes on to talk about some of the different theories about how leprosy might be caused, which I won't run through. The advantage of addressing leprosy in this kind of register would be potentially quite significant in terms of finding an authoritative medical definition of the text and presenting leprosy in a systematic way that reflects contemporary medical learning. Servasanto himself, in this extract, is simply quoting almost verbatim from an encyclopedia written by Bartholomew of England, an encyclopedia called De Proprietatibus Rerum, which gathered together medical theories about leprosy, creating a resource that could be used by preachers who wanted to populate their sermons with medical theory or with learning from other disciplines. So it's a large and fairly comprehensive encyclopedia. And Servasanto quotes this almost verbatim at the beginning of his sermon, but then doesn't really do much with it. He abandons this medical line of thought and starts to talk about other matters. Some other preachers, however, engaged with medical conceptualizations of leprosy in a much more systematic and much more sustained way. And I think the most important example I've come across of this is from Luca da Betonto, who's around in the 1230s. And he wrote a sermon on, well, this is a sermon for the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, so it is on 10 leprous men who run up to Christ and seek healing, as related in Luke 17. And rather than defining and describing the disease and its characteristics by using scripture or by drawing upon a general sense of what people might think of leprosy, Luca da Betonto uses relatively newly translated medical theories to structure his series of metaphors. He sets out a definition of leprosy that is almost verbatim coming from a tract known as the Practica of Plateario, who was a Salernitan author of the 11th century. So on this slide, Luca is on the left and Plateario is on the right. And I apologize, this is only in Latin, but in fact, you don't really need to understand in order to see that the type of language being used is consistent across these two texts. So even if you cannot follow the meaning, I think you should hopefully be able to see some similarity. And in fact, I do. Yes, I do have the English translations up. That would have been a better slide to show. So Luca writes that leprosy is a complete corruption or infection of the members from a putrefaction of the humors, and it signifies mortal sin that corrupts the entire person and makes them abominable to God. He then borrows from Practica a fourfold subclassification of leprosy according to the four humors, with each of the humoral types of leprosy being associated with a given animal. And having done this, he then runs through the symptoms of leprosy that are associated with each subgroup. And even at this level, the symptoms that he is giving match very closely those that are described in contemporary medical textbooks, such as Plateario's Practica. Luca goes on to use this medicalized description to explain how leprosy represents sin. And for each of the four subtypes of leprosy he talks about, he connects them with a given example of sin. So in the excerpt that is visible on the slide here, he is talking about alopecia, which is named after the fox and is a form of leprosy that arises when the blood is corrupted. He runs through these symptoms, and having done so, he then runs back through them, explaining how they all represent behaviors or characteristics of people who are engaging in the sin of luxuria or excessive lust. So for instance, he suggests that just as this type of disease begins with the eyes, so too does lust begin with the sight of something that is desired. He writes that the eyebrows, which are there to protect the physical eyes, represent reverence of God and fear of hell. And the loss of the eyebrows, which happens physically to those with this type of leprosy, demonstrates the sinner who becomes vulnerable to lust by losing their reverence of God and their fear of hell. Similarly, the mind of the lecher is inflated in luxuria, just as the face of someone who has this type of leprosy swells due to the disease. Similarly, the disease makes the face turn red, and the mind of the lecher also ought to be red with shame for the shameful deeds they have corrupted. Alopecia, this form of leprosy, corrupts the nose, and the lecher is incapable of smelling the stench of their own sin. And finally, leprosy, this form of leprosy, causes blood to flow, just as luxuria, corrupting others, causes sin to flow down and cascade upon others. So Luca uses this medicalized description of leprosy to structure in a very systematic way his account of the sins with which he wishes to convict his audience. And he goes on to do the same for the other types of leprosy. So I think this is significant for a number of reasons. As I've mentioned, Luca's use of advanced medical theory is significantly earlier than other texts, other sermons that do the same thing. So this seems to be a very early representation of a phenomenon that would become more common. So that in itself is one significant finding of some of the work that I have been doing at the BSR. Very briefly, stepping back to conclude and reflecting on these three different modes or strategies I have been discussing, I think in some respects, it's difficult to come to a clear conclusion about the significance of these ways of thinking about leprosy. And earlier on in this project, I had hoped that there would be some clear patterns that might emerge within the way different preachers handled this material. So for instance, are certain ways of thinking about and describing leprosy particularly common amongst certain religious orders or in certain periods or in preachers associated with certain locations? And I have not been able to identify any clear patterns or trends, with the exception of the fact that it's only from around about the 1240s that sophisticated medical theory appears in these texts. On the one hand, that's mildly disappointing, because it would be nice to have a very punchy takeaway from this material about the way in which perceptions of leprosy changed over time. But on the other hand, I think that the variety of resources and the variety of metaphors that were available to medieval preachers demonstrates the valency of leprosy as a source of spiritual metaphor, and demonstrates the way in which different ways of thinking about this disease and of exploiting images of this disease were universally useful to 13th century preachers tackling sermons on leprosy. So indeed, to conclude and to come back to my hypothetical question with which I answered, if I were a 13th century Dominican friar trying to think about how best to convince my audience that they were sinners and deciding to do this in a sermon on leprosy, I would be able to choose carefully between a number of different ways of presenting this disease. I could draw upon a very rich, very authoritative biblical tradition describing, modeling, and constructing leprosy by using scripture. I could decide to draw on contemporary social experiences, to use ideas about the fear of leprosy, ideas about the appearance of leprosy, ideas about the exclusion of people with leprosy from society, in order to try to shock my audience into heeding my message of penance. Or I could draw on newly available medical theory to try to describe leprosy in systematic and minute detail, and in doing so, to highlight its correspondences with the sins of my audience. And I think at that point, I will conclude before my throat gives out. So thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Ed, for that really fascinating and often quite gruesome lecture with plenty of gore in it, and also for managing to keep going despite clearly being on the verge of getting a nasty dose of precious flu if you haven't already got full-blown precious flu. So we really appreciate that, and I hope that you can hang on for a couple of questions, but we won't keep you long because you're clearly not well. So I should have mentioned at the beginning, I didn't do my job properly. I should have mentioned to everybody that there is a Q&A function, and you are really welcome to put a question in the box if you have one, and I will feed it through to our speaker. but perhaps I can start with my question, which kind of jumps off what your concluding point really about the valency of leprosy as a metaphor in sermons, because you gave us a really wonderful kind of summary of these three sources of the biblical, social, and medical models that preachers could draw on. And I was wondering about the other side of it, about the reception. I was wondering about, well, I suppose the size of the population. In other words, how is this something that is so visible that a preacher knows that their listening audience is absolutely ready to recognize this kind of language, or is it intended to be instructive? So I suppose it's really how many lepers were there visible on the streets of medieval Italy.
Thanks, Abigail. That's a very good question, to which I don't have an immediate, precise, exact answer in terms of a figure, a number. There may well be estimates of how many lepers there would have been. However, I think that most people in the Middle Ages probably would have had at least some familiarity with the concept, even if they're not intimately familiar with the symptoms of disease. So for instance, they're not necessarily going to recognize a detailed medical description. But in terms of being aware that there are people who are lepers who are around and about and they are fearful and you should avoid them, those kind of ideas I think probably were quite widespread. In many ways it's difficult to measure. It isn't just in sermons that we get some of these ideas about lepers living apart and lepers being abominable. And if we look, for instance, at the hagiography of St. Francis, he is an example of a man who lived in Assisi, so not a tremendously large settlement. But if we take, well, in fact, his own testament talks about leprosy. So as a young man, he was aware that lepers were around and he used to try and avoid them. So if that example is representative of people in general, then I think we could say that there would be something there in the minds and experiences of most people that could be played upon or exploited.
That's really interesting. So that this is a deliberate kind of metaphorical play on a kind of set of understandings and expectations that the preacher knows is present in the group they're talking to. Yeah. I
think so. Yeah, that's my reading, but I accept there is an element of speculation in that. The other thing worth pointing out is that even if it's difficult to measure populations of people with the disease, it is easier to try to map leprosy hospitals, leprosaria, and most of the Italian communes have one or more by the 13th century. So there are at least 3 around Assisi, for example, which is the material I know best.
It sounds from a layman's perspective like a high number, but yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Ed. We don't have any other questions in the question box, and I am going to, rather than, oh yes, we do. One has just popped in. So I don't know if you can also see that question from Teresa Whitcomb. The leper in your first slide looked like he might have had chicken pox. Was that the standard stylized way of depicting leprosy in medieval illustrations? Great question, actually. Chicken pox and a large fish.
Yes, it was. In almost all media and throughout most of the Middle Ages, dots on the skin is how the disease is visually represented. So it's quite interesting that even as there are different ways textually of describing, diagnosing leprosy, the visual strategies for depicting it remain quite stable. So Constantine as well is depicted in a similar way in those images, and I think in most other images I'm aware of leprosy from the Middle Ages, it's this same stylized approach.
Yeah, which forms an interesting kind of parallel with your sort of linguistic metaphor, visual metaphor, sort of. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Any other questions from our audience, or do we let this sick man retire to his bed and somebody can bring him a fish and all will be well? Thank you so much again, Ed. That was really fun and fascinating and enjoyable and deeply scholarly, and just exactly what a Wednesday evening calls for. I'm sorry that you had to do it while you weren't feeling well.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't a bit more sprightly.
There's an excellent example outside the walls of Monte San Martino in the Marche. Church was also a leprosarium, intensely frescoed. That's an excellent piece of knowledge. So
great.
Leprosy in the style with the chicken pox. One for the bank of future images. Thank you very much, Susan Wilson, for sharing that with us. So I should just mention in closing that we have recorded tonight's lecture. For better or for worse, Ed has been caught mid-fresh as blue on camera, and it will be going up on YouTube. So please, you can revisit it and enjoy it at your leisure and pass the word on. And that our next event at the BSR on the 20th of October is hybrid. This means that we have a lecturer in person in our lecture hall, but also streaming it online so that you can also join on the web and watch it from the comfort of your own home, should you wish to. That's the 20th of October. The lecturer is our newly appointed research fellow, Justin Randolph Thompson. It's a fine art related lecture of the age we are living in, and he's going to be talking about his own artistic practice. So do please join us in person if you happen to be in Rome, online otherwise, and thank you so much again to Edward Sutcliffe for such a fascinating lecture, and we wish you better, Ed.
Thank you.
All right.